O Lord, teach us to number our days aright, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Amen. Dear fellow believers, represented by our great high priest, Jesus Christ. Today is the second Sunday of End Times. Reformation Sunday is actually the first Sunday of End Times, but today is the day that we start to focus on what's going to happen on the last day. That topic has been on the minds of Christians ever since Jesus said 20 centuries ago, "I'm coming back soon." This is now the 23rd time that I've preached through the season of End Times. And it brings up a question, doesn't it? If Jesus is coming back soon, how can all this time have passed? And what results from that realization is a lot of times we know what Jesus says, we believe what Jesus says, we know he's coming back soon, but we have a hard time living that way, don't we? Like we truly are living in the end times. I did a little research this week and I ran some numbers, and I found out that every year Americans spend $16 billion on cosmetic surgery. $52 billion spent on sports equipment and gym memberships. And here's the big one, $3.2 trillion on health care. All to make sure that these bodies of ours stay in tip-top shape, even though we know as Christians living in the end times that these bodies are going to turn to dust. $100 billion we spend on cars that transport us from here to there, even though we know they're going to end up in a pile of rust and rubber. The average 401k account for Americans, $100,000. We want to make sure we have enough money to make sure that we can live comfortably, because we're all going to live for a good long time. You see what I mean? There's a disconnect between what Jesus tells us, what we believe about being in the end times, and our focus. We understand as Christians, the most important thing is our soul and the spiritual, and yet we spend a whole lot of money on the physical and the temporal. And that kind of reveals a focus, doesn't it? A focus not on the end times, but on the here and now. Well, along comes the writer of Hebrews. He throws everything up in the air. And he takes our focus off of those earthly things, those physical things, and he points us directly at the end times truth. Couple things you need to know today. First of all, your sin, my sin, demands death. And secondly, there is judgment in every single one of our futures. That's a problem. Two big problems, in fact. We are sinful, our sin demands death, and secondly, there is judgment in our future. But the book of Hebrews today gives us comfort, because it reminds us that Jesus is the one-time solution for our two big problems. You know, I bet those young people at that country bar in Los Angeles, they thought they were going to live a good long time, and then all of a sudden, someone dressed in all black pulls out a gun and starts shooting the place up. Most of them were underage college students, certainly not thinking about the end of their life, and yet I bet every single one that survived today is thinking about the brevity of life. But it's funny, isn't it, how we tend to look at our lives. We think we know how they're going to go. We're going to meet that person we love most in the world. We're going to get married to them. We're going to have children. We're going to see our children grow up and graduate from high school, and then they're going to meet that special someone, and they're going to give us grandchildren, and together with our spouse, we're going to grow old. And then something like that shooting happens and throws everything up in the air. Or maybe you hear by email that one of your classmates has gone home to heaven. I'm 50 years old. That just happened to me this month. Or maybe you get to that age where you're not surprised by people who are leaving this world, but every once in a while you'll hear about somebody who was in great shape, who really took care of themselves. They were right there mentally. But they couldn't escape death either. Why is that? Why is it that we tend to think that we're going to live to a ripe old age, even though we know that's not necessarily the case? We tend to think about our death, we tend to think about judgment way off into the horizon, and then the writer of the book of Hebrews shakes us up. He shakes us up and he startles us by reminding us about the inevitability of death. He doesn't even ease into it. He just lays it out there and said, man is destined to die once, and after that to face judgment. It's an inescapable truth. It's an undeniable fact. It's an unavoidable event. You can bury your head in the sand. You can distract yourself by living only for the moment. But the fact is, death is coming for every single one of us. You ever stop to think about what a sad truth that is? Because that's not how God intended it. When God made the first two people on this earth, they were going to live forever. In a commentary that I'm reading right now, written by one of my seminary professors, he makes the point that God created Adam and Eve in created innocence. In other words, they were sinless from the moment God put the first breath in them. And had they avoided the temptation, had they restrained themselves from eating from the one tree God had forbidden, they would have lived in conscious holiness. In other words, they wouldn't have to experience what it means to rebel against God's will and bring about the horrible consequences of that rebellion. If they really were in conscious holiness, they would have known, and they never would have dreamed of rebelling against God. They wouldn't have to wonder what God's will from the perspective of their inability to keep that will. They would have known it. Because their will would be in perfect harmony with God's will. And their desire to obey God would have been just as great as God's desire for them to obey Him. But when they doubted those promises of God, when they questioned His goodness, and chose to follow that sinful desire to be like God, knowing good and evil, it ruined God's perfect world. And the most significant illustration of that ruin is the fact that now God, who created man to live forever, now He was going to have to watch as they would die. And it wasn't just the people who sinned in the garden that were affected by this corruption, this brokenness. It was every single one of their descendants who would follow. It was you and it was me. Man is destined to die. The end of life would have been sad enough, but it was the ruin of all of God's creation too. And now not only are we destined to die, The second problem we have is that after we die, we face judgment. Judgment. I want you to wrap your brains around that for a second. Judgment, standing before a God from whom nothing is hidden and nothing is secret. Judgment before a God who demands nothing less than absolute perfect obedience and holiness. Judgment before a God who doesn't accept any excuses and doesn't care a whit if you're really trying. Can you measure up to that? Do I have to dig beneath the surface of the Ten Commandments to expose our sin again? Just take the first commandment. You shall have no other gods. Let's pair that together with the third commandment. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. I'm not going to ask Packer fans today because your team and my team is so messed up, we probably wish they weren't even playing today. So I'm going to ask you Bear fans and you Packer fans, during this worship service, this is a picture of God's rest, His Sabbath. This is the day that God has set apart and made holy for you to focus on His gracious giving of that rest in Jesus Christ. During this worship service, this 1 hour, have you thought about the kickoff at all? Or maybe football's not your thing. During this riveting sermon of mine, have you inspected the inside of your eyelids? Just for a second. One day, 1 hour, that God has given us to rejoice in and focus on His rest. We can't do it. We're incapable of following His commands. Those are 2 commandments. Remember the Sabbath day, which ultimately breaks the first commandment, right? Because for this moment, my entertainment, my own desires have become my God. And we could go down every single one of those commandments. We could peel back the layers and we could find our guilt in every single one of them. And we come to a quick conclusion. We don't just live in a broken world. We're part of it. We add to the ugliness of this ruined creation because of who we are. This past week I was listening to the radio and I heard a talk show host talking about what in the world causes someone to shoot up a country dance bar. He was just lamenting over the fact. What can the doctors tell us about someone like this? What can the psychologists add? Where does this come from? And I wanted to scream at him through the radio. I know exactly where it comes from. It comes from man's heart. Not some men's hearts, but all people's hearts. Evil lives inside of us. That's what Jesus Himself says. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. The question is not what is causing the problem. That's easy. The question is, what do we do about it? And human beings, they have their own way of dealing with that issue. Last week we were talking about the Reformation. And as we did, we realized that in the Catholic Church during Luther's time, they were dealing with the sin of man by saying, you just need to try harder. You just need to do more. You need to make sure that all your evil deeds are balanced out with good things that you've done on the other side. That scale never balances. It just doesn't. Not before a judge who demands no sin and all righteousness. That sin is still there. No matter how much I try to balance out that scale, that doesn't work. We have a little different way of doing it in the modern world today, and in our culture especially. There's something called postmodernism, and I've talked about it before, but I'm going to define it for you again. Postmodernism is the idea in our culture that says there is no such thing as absolute truth. Truth is what I decide truth is, and nothing is true unless it's true for me. Do you see what that does when it comes to the matter of our guilt? If there is nothing that is absolutely true, then I become the judge. And if something isn't absolutely true, well then, I certainly don't have to feel guilty about it. I can just shove it aside and wipe it away. There is no absolute truth is just another way of saying there is no absolute guilt. None of those solutions, neither of those solutions work with a God who sees everything. Neither of those two solutions work for a God who demands perfection. What's far more important than how we think we need to deal with our problem of sin and the fact that judgment is coming is how God chose to deal with it. One of the first things God did for his people is to teach these truths in a very visual way. He taught his people, when you come to worship, when you come to glorify me, you bring with you sacrifices, animal sacrifices. It was part of their worship system. They would come to God's temple and they would place those sacrifices on the altar of God. He was teaching his people a truth. The very same truth that the writer of Hebrews talks about in the verses just before our reading. This is what he says. The law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. The only way to get rid of guilt is not to deny it, not to make up for it, but to sacrifice for it, to shed blood for it, the blood of a substitute. The way you escape God's anger, the way you receive God's forgiveness, is to shed blood. And every year there was a special day called the Day of Atonement. And the priest, the great high priest, the high priest would have to come before God's people, and he would have to take off his normal clothes and put on special clothes. And then he would go into the most holy place where the presence of God was, and he would make a sacrifice, first for himself. And he would take the sacrifice, the blood of the sacrifice of that bull, and he would sprinkle it on himself. And then he would take another sacrifice, the sacrifice of a goat, and he would sacrifice it for the sins of the people. He would take that blood and sprinkle it on the altar. I said before, it's an illustration, though. An illustration, not the solution itself. It wasn't the solution itself because the priest had to keep on doing that over and over and over again, every single year, because the priest was going into a copy of the real temple that was in heaven. The priest was a stand-in for the great high priest Jesus. And the sacrifices and the blood, they were substitutes for the real sacrifice and the real blood that Jesus would shed on the cross. And it didn't matter how many days he entered that man-made temple. It didn't matter how many animals that had to be slaughtered and how many gallons of blood that were sprinkled on that altar. It was never going to be enough to escape God's judgment. So God had to come up with a solution. A single solution. A one-time solution that didn't depend on man. The writer says, Christ did not enter heaven to offer himself again and again the way the high priest enters the most holy place. The sacrifice of Christ didn't have to be offered over and over again because he wasn't offering the blood of an imperfect animal from a corrupt and broken world. He was offering God's blood. God's blood that could truly cover your guilt. God's blood that could truly wash your sin away and do it completely. Jesus says it from the cross, doesn't he? It is finished. It's paid for in full. Just before he gave up his life. That's what he said from the cross. The author of this reading puts it this way: but now he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. God's one-time solution for our sins solves our problem of guilt by paying for it. And it doesn't only solve our problem of sin, it solves our problem of judgment too. The evidence is airtight. Stacked up against us, Satan is laying it all out before the judge, and it's a done deal. Open and shut case. And we have every right to expect that the judge is going to slam down his gavel and say, guilty, guilty, guilty. But instead, he says, not guilty. For we who have been covered in the blood, the perfect blood of our substitute, Jesus Christ, we will hear not guilty through faith. Hebrews says Jesus will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. Your verdict, rejoice, rejoice today. Your verdict is not guilty, innocent, forgiven, and saved. Doesn't that change Judgment Day for us? It takes away all the fear. It takes away all the apprehension and all the anxiety about standing before that perfect judge, because I have Jesus' holiness. I have his forgiven. My guilt is gone. My sin is removed, and I'm going to stand before him and hear God say, not sinner, but saint. And not only does it change the way we look forward to that last day, it changes the way we live today too. It takes our focus off those earthly things, those physical things. We live every day not focused on these, but focused on the bodies that will be glorified. We focus not on our transportation, our way to get from here to there. We focus on the fact that we are going to be transported from this life into a new one. We live for a different kind of retirement. A retirement that's never going to run short. We're never going to run out, but we will have the riches that last forever. God, he solved our big two problems. Our problem that sin demands death, and our problem that judgment is in our future, by giving us Jesus to take away our sin and to die our death, so that we can hear that verdict of not guilty. And when I look forward to that last day, and I see Jesus coming from the clouds, and I hear the trumpet blast, I can look up and look forward in joy, because Jesus is coming, bringing us salvation. Live every day like that day is coming anytime soon.